Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody for coming to the webinar today on best practices for moderating panels and workshops. This is directed specifically for folks who are going to be moderating at the DLF Forum this year, but it's also good if you're here because you're a presenter or just interested in learning about moderating practices. So again, thank you for coming. My name is Helene Williams, and on the next slide, you'll be able to see who's going to be talking today. So I'm Helene Williams, coming to you from University of Washington, and we'll be hearing from Paige Morgan, who's at University of Delaware, and Sheila Rabun, who is at Lyrasis. Oh, and also, thank you, Aaliyah. This is also aimed at folks who are moderating at DigiPres. So if you're in that part of the audience, thank you for coming. Welcome. And I'm just going to set us up here, and then I'm going to turn this over to Paige and Sheila. And so on the next slide, the goal today is to give you the information and the tools and tactics you need to have the speakers and the audience both get what they come to the presentation for, which is a smooth session that runs on time, where everybody has a voice and everybody gets something out of it, a win-win. And so we have broken this down into several segments, and the first one is, how do you prepare to do this as a moderator or a presenter? And so I'm going to turn this over to Sheila. I'm like, whose cat is that? That must be Sheila.
Yes, that is my cat, Mika. So I'll get us started off by covering some of the early planning actions that you can take to help make your job as a moderator as easy as possible. So on the next slide, you should have already received an email from Aaliyah at DLF with instructions for reaching out to the people who will be presenting at the session that you're moderating. There's a Google Doc for those who are moderating sessions where multiple presentations are going to be happening. And there's a separate doc for those moderating a panel or a workshop session. And I will post those links to those Google Docs into the chat in just a minute. But this slide outlines the logistical things that you'll need to touch base on with your presenters ahead of time. So it's a good idea to coordinate with your presenters to get everyone's slides on one laptop ahead of time so that you're not wasting time switching between machines during the session. So you can have people send their presentations to you, share via Google Slides, or bring their presentation on a flash drive to transfer the day of before the session starts. But it's always also a good idea to have backup options. So having presentations on a thumb drive, having a PDF version of slides, just in case there are any wonky font transfer issues. And also note that this year, all slides should be in the 16:9 ratio. And as the moderator, you'll most likely be introducing the presenters. So make sure to get clarity on people's pronouns and how to pronounce their names, as well as the people's current titles and institutional affiliations. So all of that, hopefully you can figure out ahead of time. And I will cover some of the other logistics like timekeeping, accessibility, and sharing on the next slides. So if we go to the next slide, thanks. So as the moderator, you will be keeping time for your presenters. All of the sessions are going to be 55 minutes long, and that includes a variety of different sessions. There are the 7-minute snapshots, which I believe there are 7 of those 7-minute snapshots in one 55-minute session. There are also 18-minute presentations, so 3 of those within one session. And then there are also panel sessions that take the full 55 minutes, and also workshops. Next slide, please. So when it comes to timekeeping, just double check the type of session that you are moderating and make sure that your presenters know ahead of time what to look for and how you will signal to them that time is running out or if they are out of time. So for example, I'm planning to set a timer on my phone and then just have signs on paper to hold up that indicate 10-minute, 5-minute, and 1-minute warnings. or you could have a hand signal. It's really up to you, but just make sure that everyone has a shared understanding of how the timekeeping will work. And that those time limits are for everyone. That's presenters, audience members. It's really important to make sure that the timekeeping is attended to, so that everyone has a chance to speak and gets the full benefit of the amount of time that they are allotted. So in terms of letting people know when the time is up for a particular portion, in the past I've used a bell or a chime, or if you have a timer on your phone, you could have it make a distinctive noise like a duck quacking or something else. So if you have ideas about timekeeping or strategies that you're thinking of, feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat and we can discuss them a little bit later. But just want to make sure that everybody is aware of the timekeeping responsibilities and starts thinking about that ahead of time. Next slide, thank you. So in relation to that, keep in mind that the session times include Q&A and discussion. So make sure that your presenters know this and plan accordingly. So for example, if you're moderating a session that has 3 18-minute presentations, those 3 18-minute slots, that will need to include time for Q&A. So you'll need to decide ahead of time whether you want Q&A, in between each of the presentations, or if you want to hold all of the questions and discussion to the end. But make sure that your presenters know that they need to plan to allot time for Q&A. And just reflecting on this, the Q&A and discussion can often be even more informative than the presentation itself. So bottom line is, make sure to leave enough time and make sure that you and your presenters have a shared understanding of how that Q&A and discussion time is going to work. Great. And on the accessibility note, you will also want to direct your presenters to resources about slide and presentation accessibility ahead of time. There's a recorded presentation from a few years ago that is recommended to watch, and that link is right here on the slide. Or if people don't have time to watch a recording, I put a few other resources linked here on this slide, but basically if you Google accessible slides or accessible presentations, you'll see several resources pop up that at least cover the basics for making presentations accessible, including considerations around things like colors and contrast, fonts, and including alternative text for images, that kind of thing. So make sure that your presenters know ahead of time to look at least some basic accessibility guidelines so that they can make sure to reach the widest audience possible and be inclusive with their presentation. Next slide. And also make sure your presenters know that they're encouraged to share their slides on DLF's Open Science Framework repository. They can certainly wait until after their presentation to upload their slides there, but making those slides available to the audience either before or after the presentation is always a good way to continue the conversations past the session. And also, provide any links or references that they may have presented on. So the link to that repository is right there. And next, I think Paige is going to cover tips for once you arrive at DLF.
Thanks so much, Sheila. So when you get to DLF, and here I have to confess that I find it easier to start doing this stuff before I leave, but I know that depending on the timing of your flight, the timing of your work beforehand, it can be tricky. So I hope that you will be able to adapt this advice to the reality that you're working with. Oops, sorry, there we go. So one of the things that I find really helpful for moderating a session is creating a prep sheet a one-pager. It can be printed out, it can be handwritten in clear, legible type, but that becomes my master guide to what I'm doing. And you see sort of a mini example of it here on the right-hand side. I try to create as much white space as possible just so that I can read things easily. And that prep sheet might include the room where you're going to be and potentially any directions that you might need to find the room. And if you can get in early enough to find the room in advance, then I find that that usually makes the whole process of moderating a lot smoother. But I usually make sure that I've put down the phonetic pronunciation, phonetic for me, since I have not yet mastered the phonetic alphabet. But something that will make sure that I am reading people's names correctly and introducing them. And indeed, pronouns are a great thing to put here as well. And a note as you're thinking about this, if you run into trouble, if a mic isn't working, if a screen isn't working, or a projector, if you find that you are desperate for a dongle, then using the DLF Village hashtag, and if you might be a moderator who's not a Twitter person, that's totally fine. My experience at DLF is that it's really easy to ask someone who's there to say, hey, is anyone on Twitter? Can somebody tweet at the DLF Village hashtag? And the DLF community has been really responsive in making sure that they send folks who can help with the tech and get things in working order. Sorry, having driven slides for other people, I'm finding that I have to use a different command to drive them when I'm unmuted, which is odd, but okay. So during the presentation, or at the start of it, it's worth noting that every session actually has a shared note-taking doc, and there's a short link in the slides, bit.ly/2019 DLF, which is case sensitive. And so one thing that you can do is encourage attendees who are online to type their questions into that Google Docs notes sheets for your session. That can make it easier for everyone to see what other folks are thinking. It's also worth reminding folks about the particular hashtags for the forum, whether it's DLF or digital preservation, and the session tags, which just makes it easier for people to track and focus on the particular sessions that they're attending, or if they happen to be peeking at another session or trying to keep track of it. Maybe somebody is not in your session because they couldn't attend, but they really want to know what's happening, and making sure that people who tweet are using the little session tags like S1C is really important. It's worth noting too, in terms of the accessibility front, I only learned this a couple years ago, but you'll note that the hashtag for DLF Forum has the first 3 letters capitalized. And that's not just that we refer to it as DLF, it's that for screen readers and accessible technology, that technology will read capital letters differently than lowercase letters. If it sees capital letters, then it'll actually pronounce them as initials. And if you use just all lowercase letters, then it'll actually try to pronounce that as one word, so Dilforum or something. And so if you can remember to use appropriate capitals within the hashtag, then that will really help folks out. Okay, so continuing on the accessibility front, one thing that's really, really important and really tricky, but it makes such a huge difference in making the session work for everyone, is not just using the mic, but making sure that the folks who are speaking know how to hold the mic so that the mic actually accomplishes its function. And this can be a little bit tricky because, frankly, lots of mics are a little bit quirky and a little bit different. So, but in general, you want to hold them, well, as a friend of mine says, almost as though you're going to kiss the mic. So we've got a graphic down here. You really want to point the mic so that the sound is coming out of your mouth and going directly into the mic, rather than, say, holding the mic below your mouth so that the sound is going past it. And if your presenters if you can get your presenters to get to the session just even 5 to 7 minutes early and just quickly test the mic with all of them, then that can help immensely. And likewise, if you can agree on a signal, and often for me, I just mime holding the mic properly, then that can really help folks remember as they are giving their paper and just really focusing on that. Likewise, if there are folks here who are listening to this because they are going to be speaking and presenting at DLF, then just remembering and even practicing or putting a note at the top of your notes that says hold the mic horizontally. That's something that I've done before when I've been presenting and when I've wanted to make sure that I remember. Okay. So it's always good to check and make sure, do all the speakers have water? Do they need it? To remind the speakers and audience how the Q&A will work, and make sure you've already ideally briefed your presenters on this in the advanced email presentations that Sheila discussed, but it's often really important to let the audience know so that they don't expect something that's not going to happen. For example, I will note that Helene and I have in the past given up our Q&A time, or almost all of it, just in order to be able to present more. And so we've specifically said, come and talk to us after the session if you want to talk about questions. And if that's happening, then the audience really needs to know that that's how you're going to do things. And of course, remind the audience members about the hashtag and the note-taking docs, and start your timer. And I will put in a vote for the duck alarm as a particularly effective way to gently cut things off when people go over. It's hard to keep on going when you have a duck quacking in the background. So during the session, as people are going, if you can, but it's really okay not to do this. Moderating requires a lot of multitasking, and it's really okay to say, all right, I can't do quite all of that. So if there were something that I were going to give up, then it would be watching the hashtag. But watching the hashtag can work. Noting a question or two from the hashtag if you are following it, or just something in case there is a lull afterwards. And if your timer rings, then gently but firmly thank the presenter and move on to the next person. And I usually say, when I have to do this, I try to emphasize, you can talk to this presenter at the break. I know they'd love to share more of their work with the audience, so it's hard to cut people off, but it is important. And I'm going to turn things over to Helene to talk about the Q&A and closing the session.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you, Sheila. This is all such great information. And so, yeah, I'm going to be the bad cop here in terms of Q&A, because sometimes that's where a lot of the work comes in. If your presenters are on time, that's great. We just need to make sure the audience stays on time. And one of the things, when Paige said it can be very difficult to cut off a presenter, I know it makes people uncomfortable, but it's an equity issue that any time a presenter goes over, they're taking away time from some other voice that needs needs to be heard. And as part of the DLF Forum Planning Committee, I can say we take very seriously how many voices there are going to be in a session and how presentations fit together. And so you don't want to obviate all the work that went into that planning, and especially the other presenter who's, getting cut off. So it's really important that you kind of take charge and say, thank you, we're moving on. So now we get to Q&A, whether that is during, the 18 minutes of somebody's presentation, or if it's all lumped together at the end. And so things that you can do to help this run smoothly is remind audience members to be concise. The other thing you can do, and I recommend everybody do this, is remind the audience that we're looking for questions, not comments. There's a link here to a Twitter thread that talks about, here are some best practices for making sure that you do get actual questions, not comments. And it's some of the tactics here, such as having people turn to each other in the audience and take a minute just to voice what is their question, can really prompt some much deeper questions and some much better communication and critical engagement with the presentations than if you leap right into questions. So if you have adequate time for questions, I would recommend that you try to kind of crowdsource those questions as well. Using the microphone is just as important during Q&A as it is during presentation time. And so that means you as a moderator may be running around the room to hand the microphone to audience members, and that means helping them hold it correctly or repeating the question if you can tell that not everybody in the room heard it. And you don't know the shape of your room until you're in there. So if it's a long, skinny room, chances are you're going to be repeating those questions to make sure everybody on the panel and everybody in the audience heard the questions. Now, if you have the unexpected lull before the questions start, which frankly, I've never seen at a DLF because everybody is so engaged, you can always ask the audience a question. What do you think about the affinities between these presentations or the contrasts? Or you can say, all right, let's turn to your neighbor and, ask, your neighbor what they thought about the presentations. Or as Paige was talking before, you as the moderator should be able to come up with a question to get things started if there is a lull. But I do have to say that at DLF, I have never had that happen. That's one of the reasons I love DLF, because everyone is so engaged. Balance the Q&A between the panelists so that not one panelist or section of presenters is getting all the questions. And as Aaliyah noted in the chat, there is no Q&A time allotted for the 7-minute snapshots. And so that's something where you are going to, as the next slide says, remind audience members that they can talk to the panelists after the session or reach out after the session. Most of the panelists do put their contact information in the slides, so the audience members should have been able to get that if it's something where they're not able to stay after the session. Sorry, it's Monday morning here in Seattle, so I'm still kind of sludgy. And as you're closing the session, remind the panelists about the OSF repository for slides. Hopefully many of them have already put their slides in at this point. And then you want to thank the presenters and the audience for their attention and their time. Everybody has worked hard here to make this session work, and it's definitely worth thanking them. And thank yourself too, because I know that moderating can be kind of an unnerving experience because you're trying to track time and you're trying to track presenters. And something that happened to me one year as a moderator was I used a new timer on my phone, and I had not practiced enough with how do I actually turn that thing off when it goes off. And so that might happen to you. So I suggest practicing with that timer before you walk into the room saying, I got this brand new timer. So it can be unnerving. And so thank yourself. Everybody at DLF and everybody on the planning committee thanks you for taking on the job of moderating, because it means that you're putting your energy towards something else while the rest of us are enjoying the presentations, while you're having to pay attention to a couple of extra things. Okay, and my last slide is to remind you that there is an active bystander orientation session, and the information about that is here, and that will be next week. And this is something that goes along with moderating, that if you do need to divert or distract from something that is going on, if you see microaggressions or hear something going on, that as part of the DLF community, it's part of all of our charge to take action on that. And again, that can be something where you might be feeling uncomfortable, and I think this session will help you learn some tactics and some strategies, and it may come into use while you're moderating your session. So that is all I have, and I think we are at the slide where we get to turn things over to you. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand or type them into the chat, and Paige, Sheila, and I will be glad to answer them. So thank you for your attention thus far, and let us know what we missed.
While people are thinking of potential questions or comments or ideas, I'll say that I am going to be moderating a session, and I created just a one-page document, like what Paige had been speaking about earlier, that just has the names and pronouns and titles of the different people that I'll be introducing. And along with that, because I'm moderating a session where there are going to be 3 18-minute presentations, so I calculated the times that each of the presentations should start and put those times on the sheet as well, so I'm not kind of like fumbling around questioning, what time things are supposed to begin and end and all of that. So that may be something that could be helpful for other people too, is if you are going to have a little info sheet for your moderation, including the times that the different presentations are supposed to start and end. Unless you're moderating a panel or a workshop, because then typically they're just kind of one long thing, but just an idea.
I would second that, what Aaliyah just said, that is how I have moderated, and it has worked so well to have, because you're trying to track like 3 different things at once, have a written document that has the time, has the names, has what you're going to say, to remember, to remind people to use the mic, that kind of thing. All on one document has been very helpful in not getting distracted by shuffling papers around. Oh, Sheila, sorry. Well, you all have good ideas, so thank you all for your good ideas.
Yeah, I just want to second that, though it was not my idea, Sheila. I really totally agree with that, and I think you could even use the workspace of the shared notes to set up some of that, if that would be helpful. And if you're comfortable having that information sort of out and accessible to folks, you could use that, and then that's a space that everyone can see as well. But of course, you're welcome to do, your own separate organizing sheet as well, whatever works for you.
Awesome, I love that idea. Other thoughts or comments or questions?
We've been so thorough. We have answered every potential question. Maybe that's it. I know that more questions might come up later as you, the moderator, are pulling together all your information, and that's why our contact information is here. You can reach out to us.
So we actually do have a new question from someone who asks, how do you check Twitter and maintain time at the same time using your one device? And that's a great question, and I will note that I actually tend to use 2 devices when I possibly can. I usually have my laptop open, and that's where I'm checking Twitter, and I'll have the timer running on my phone though there are certainly timers that you can use that are on the internet that will go off for you. One of the ones that I like is called Egg Timer, and I think it's e.gg.timer.com, and you can actually put in, it's easy to set down to the second should you want to do that, and then it will beep at the end and you can actually see the tab in your browser and it'll tell you how much time is left. So that's just one option. There are other online timers. Some people might want to use that and use their phone for tweets. It depends on you. And again, man, especially if you're moderating for the first time, I honestly, and especially at, well, my experience at DLF has been that the community is really engaged, and often there are folks who are in the session and on Twitter. If you need to not be on Twitter while you're moderating for the first time, I think that's fine. That's something that you can, I would say that you can let go of. I don't think this is really an equity and inclusivity issue, and I don't want to make the barriers to moderating so high that we exclude people from doing that or make it such a steep learning curve that folks feel uncomfortable stepping into that role.
I agree.
A really great thing to note, and just a quick note from me about not necessarily using Twitter, specifically in reference to the DLF Village and the tech support. That DLF Village hashtag is probably the quickest way to get tech support from us sort of during a session if you know, a mic battery goes out or if there's something else going on in the room. And usually people in the sessions are pretty quick to let us know about that. That's not even usually the moderators reaching out to us, but we also will have someone from DLF staff or a volunteer checking in at the beginning of every session in every room to make sure that everything looks good. And that's sort of like a first line of defense for those kinds of issues. And then sort of lastly, there will always be someone at the registration desk during the designated hours, which are like 7 to 5 pretty much every day. So if you want to check in ahead of time at the registration desk, we'll have dongles up there. So if that's, you know, you don't want to use Twitter leading up to that, there are a number of ways to get in touch with us as well. And then also the forum@digilib.org email address, we're constantly checking too. So there are a variety of ways to get in touch with us. And just want to second what I think it was Paige was saying about not wanting barriers to access for people, especially if you're moderating for the first time.
Yeah, those are all really good points. That do this the best you can, and if that means letting something drop, the Twitter piece should drop, because almost everybody will be on Twitter or some other social media, and you can rely on them. and that's one of the things, again, I love about DLF is that it's so that everybody's helping everybody else. I want to answer this next question about what have you done in the past if you can't get the needed information from the presenters, like how they pronounce their name or their pronouns. And that's a really great question, because every year that I've moderated, I have had that issue that there has been 1 or 2 presenters who just don't respond to my email. And so what I do several days before DLF is I compile an email with, all right, here's how I'm going to introduce you. Here's what I have from you, you know, thanks to those of you who have responded. And so if they don't respond to that, they get what they get, right? Where you're making up a pronunciation for their name. And almost always that has produced a response. There was once where it really was meeting the person in the front of the room, you know, 2 minutes before we were starting. And I prefer not to have that be the way I get that information. But that may be what happens. But sending out an email a few days before, reminding people, here's the room, here's the time, here's how I'm introducing you, such a good standard to get everybody there.
I will also say that, alas, I have occasionally been the person who just had so much going on that I was the one who didn't respond to that email. it happens to the best of us. And something that I have done when I've been on the moderator side of that situation, and this goes for a lot of this, it gets easier the more time you've been within at DLF, is honestly reach out to friends and colleagues and say, hey, do you know this person? Or do you know them? Do you know how they prefer to pronounce their name? To the same degree, and I think Helene and I have tag teamed for each other, so I don't feel bad about asking this. And I also, if you see me at DLF and you need a hand in your session, feel free to ask. I have said, hey, can you run the mic around the room for me? Or, hey, I'm a little bit worried about this session because it's sensitive. Can you keep an eye on the hashtag for me? And it's always worth at least asking in those situations. And sometimes I have reached out and said, hey, do you know this person? And a friend says, oh yeah, I know them. They pronounce their name like this. Their pronouns are these. And it's always good to check that with them, but with the person at the front of the room, but asking never hurts either. Glad this is all useful.
Those were good questions. I'm glad that you asked them. Does anybody else have other questions? You want to raise your hand in Zoom or type in a question, or you can, as I said, you can reach out to us individually. And this will be recorded. And Aaliyah, how are you going to send out the information about the recording?
Great question. We will probably be tweeting it out. And then we also have a sort of landing page for this moderator training on our website. I think it's under resources. I can drop the link to that in the chat here. And that will live, both the slides and the recording will live there.
Excellent. Sheila or Paige, any last words?
I don't think so. Thanks everyone for coming out from me, and I'm really looking forward to this year's DLF and to seeing all of you.
Yep, I agree. And my only last parting word would be to please definitely consider coming to the active bystander orientation. It is, I'm on the committee that is putting that together. It's the DLF Equity and Inclusion Committee. It's going to be next week. But I think it'll be really helpful just to kind of orient yourself with different bystander strategies, just in case, anything happens that you may want to intervene with. And I think it'll help everyone feel, just more prepared in general for any potential situations that might arise. So that's just my last plug for the active bystander orientation. And I have pasted the link to that in the chat there. So please do visit that page and put the session on your calendar. And that will also be recorded as well. So just stay tuned for those announcements. And that's all I've got.
Well, this is all great. And what I find most useful is that everything we've talked about today in terms of moderator training, in terms of, don't forget the accessibility of your slides and of your web pages, and active bystander training is so useful in every part of my professional life. And so that's something I'm really grateful to DLF for. And so thank you, Aaliyah and team, for that. And with that, I think we're done.
Yeah, I think, the other thing that I would say is that all you can do is the best you can to prepare, and sometimes unexpected things happen, and it's really okay if something comes up that 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 throws you for a loop. It happens, don't worry, reach out for help, and the community, I know that DLF and the rest of the community is genuinely interested and committing to finding ways of supporting moderators, presenters, and audience members.
Yes, and on that note, thank you so much to the three of you and to all of you who are on the call and all of you who are listening to the recording later. This event could not happen without people like you taking the lead on things like this training, the active bystander orientation, and taking the lead in volunteering to moderate sessions. It just isn't possible without all of you. So we're really grateful from the DLF team, and we're really looking forward to seeing you in Tampa in just, gosh, a very few weeks. So thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.